and turns he has gone through in his photographic life. And he's not going to talk to us about what equipment we should use or what software or which slider to push in which direction. He's going to talk about something that's far more important, and that is vision. So he's going to tell us of the things in his life in photography that have directed him toward finding his own personal vision and how we might be able to achieve the same thing. So if you would welcome, please, with a big wave, Cole Thompson.
Thank you, Ross. Thank you
You're
so
welcome.
much. My thanks to both you and Leif for having me. I do appreciate that you guys normally don't have a speaker or a presenter, so thanks so much for that honor. I am going to now start sharing my screen. Everybody wave. Well, I won't be able to see it, but somebody speak up if you don't see it when it comes up here. It should be up. That look good, Doss?
Good.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I'd like to say that while I am American, I am kind of a Canadian at heart, having lived in British Columbia in the 70s and have done some really good work out in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. So my heart really is up in the west of your country, and I guess now the East Coast as well. Love them both. Never been to the midsection though, or never been to your guys' area. My presentation is called Why Black and White, but it does cover more than black and white, as Doss said. So I'm just going to launch right in, but first I'm going to turn my camera off so I don't distract myself. So to understand black and white, we first must examine the history of black and white. We need to undertake a comparative and historical analysis with an emphasis on the relative intrinsic value of the inherent intermodal causeways of the medium when compared to other artistic disciplines. Wow, I hope you understood that because I didn't. But this, unfortunately for you guys, this is an incredibly boring part of my presentation. So let's get started. In the beginning, all art was created in black and white. But then color was invented and the world turned colorful. But then photography was invented and it switched back to black and white. And then Kodacolor was invented and it switched back to color. The end, the history of black and white. How many of you would buy a three-legged dog or get on an airplane with only one wing or buy a car with no wheels? So why would you then take a perfectly good color image and strip it of all color? Why? It would be like owning a Model T in a Tesla world or using wet plate photography in a digital world. It would be like owning a three-legged dog, somehow incomplete. I'd like to talk about my journey to black and white, why I love it so much, why it appeals to me, and why you might consider it. My story begins at the age of 14 while I was living in Rochester, New York. I was out for a hike one day with a friend when we stumbled upon this old ruin of a house. My friend mentioned that it had once been owned by George Eastman, and that piqued my interest. I went to the school library, checked out his biography, and began reading about really how he made photography something that everybody could afford. And as I read that book, I just fell in love with photography, the whole concept of it. And I just had this feeling that I was destined to be a photographer. And that sounds silly coming from a 14-year-old boy, much less one that had never taken a picture or had never seen that magic moment in the darkroom where a print comes up. But that's how I felt then, and that's still how I feel today. It was my destiny. And so for the next 10 years, there was nothing in my life but photography. If I wasn't shooting or processing, I was studying the works of the great masters. And as I looked at their work, I noticed I was always drawn to a particular type of image. They were always dark images, contrasty images, images that would cause a shudder to go down my spine when I saw something that I loved. And they inspired me, and they made me want to create work like that. This is my first fine art image created when I was 14 years old. So a lot of people ask, but why black and white, Cole? You were born into a color world. And I tell them that I wasn't. I was born into a black and white world. When I was a boy, television was all in black and white. Movies were in black and white. The news was delivered in black and white. And my childhood heroes were in black and white. And even our nation was still segregated into black and white. And so I created images that perhaps reflect the world that I grew up in. The truth is, I don't really understand why I love black and white. It's just something that's inside of me. For me, color records the image, but black and white reveals those feelings that lie beneath the surface. Or put another way, color is a happy meal and black and white is fine dining. So what do I look for in a black and white image? Well, as I mentioned, I love a dark image. I love a glowing subject. I love detail, especially when detail is enhanced by contrast. I love shapes, patterns, and textures. I love simple images. Increasingly, my images are becoming more and more simple. And I often use long exposures to simplify them, sometimes with water, with sky, and even with people. This image is called the Angel Gabriel, and I call this my most significant image because it was the very first time that I had used my vision to create an image. I was photographing at the pier, the Newport Beach Pier in Southern California, and it was a crowded day with many people walking past. But because I was using a 30-second exposure, most of the people disappeared. And the image was interesting, but it was lacking. It lacked a subject. So I looked around for someone I could ask to stand in, and I saw this homeless man eating French fries out of a trash can. And I approached him and asked him if he would stand in for my photograph. I'd be happy to take him to lunch. He was very wary of me. He reluctantly agreed. He wanted to hold his Bible, and this was the image that I used. Afterwards, I took this gentleman, whose name actually is Gabriel, to lunch at a 4-star restaurant. And as we entered, Gabriel was barefoot, filthy, with matted hair. As we sat and looked at the menu, I said to Gabriel, "Order anything that you like." And he said, "I'd love a steak with mushrooms and onions. I haven't had one in years." And when the waitress brought it, Gabriel picked it up with his hands and ate it. I found out that Gabriel had been a drug addict, but was now clean, but was clearly impaired from that experience. I also learned that he was Romanian, and I'm half Romanian. So we talked about the old country and my family name, Tatar. I also learned that Gabriel's father lived nearby. And so as we were parting ways, I said, "Gabriel, give me your father's address. And if I sell any of these images, I'd be happy to send you a portion." To which he responded, "Give it to someone who can really use it. I have everything that I need." And Gabriel walked away with his only 2 possessions, his Bible and a bedroll. I go back to Southern California. Well, I did 3, 4 times a year. And I always go back to the Newport Beach Pier to look for Gabriel, but I've never seen him again. So how do you learn to photograph in black and white? Here's what I did. First, I put my camera into monochrome mode and raw mode. And the and is incredibly important. In monochrome mode, it lets me see the image in black and white on the back of my camera. But because it's in raw mode, the image comes in as a color image into Photoshop. And I want it to be in color so that I can convert it. It doesn't work if you put your camera into monochrome mode and JPEG mode. And here's why. In the upper image, that's an image that I converted from a color image. The lower one is directly out of the camera in monochrome mode. A lot of the things that I do to my image are done in that conversion process, and I don't want the camera making those decisions for me. Next, learn how colors translate into shades of gray, because really black and white's about the contrast. And even more importantly, learn to manipulate those colors into different shades of gray through that conversion, black and white conversion process. And then think in terms of shapes, contrast, and composition, because with a black and white image, there's nothing to hide behind. It's a very raw image. And if you don't have a good composition, you can't hold someone's attention. So what subjects look great in black and white? Well, I think they all do. I know some people think maybe flowers or animals or birds should be done in color, but I think all subjects look great in black and white except for one, unicorns. If you see a unicorn, that should be shot in color. So I'd like to give you a sampling tonight of some of my work. I'd like to show you images from each of my different portfolios. And interspersed, I'd like to share some of my photographic philosophies. Now, what is a portfolio? A portfolio is simply a group of images that are related or tell a story. For years, I didn't shoot in portfolios. I just took greatest hits, as I called them. And I created some pretty good greatest hits, but I didn't have a cohesive body of work. There was no relationship between any of my images. Well, one year I decided that I was going to submit my work to Lenswork. And I sent off my images. Oh, and the instructions for submitting your work to Lenswork were that you should not send your greatest hits. You should send 15 to 25 images on a single subject. But I thought to myself, he's never seen my greatest hits. And so off they went. Well, they came back in just a few days with this big hand scribbled note that said, just pick one image and do 15 on that same subject. And that was the kick I needed to get myself started in portfolios. And the very first portfolio that I did was grain silos. Where I live in the Eastern Plains, on the edge of the Eastern Plains, these grain silos are the center of every small town and the center of every family farm. But I didn't want to portray them as objects of utility, but rather as objects of beauty. And so I spent 9 months just traveling the Eastern Plains, trying to see these grain silos a little bit differently. And that was the very first portfolio that I created, and it did make it into Lenswork. Now, some people ask, I've heard that you don't consider yourself a photographer. I don't. I think of myself as an artist who uses photography. For 35 years, I had a photographer's mentality. As a photographer, I almost worshiped my equipment. I was one of those guys who always had the most, the best, the newest equipment. But now as an artist, my God is the image, and my camera is simply a tool. As a photographer, my goal was to document what my eyes saw. But as an artist, my goal is to show you what I'm seeing through my vision, that image I have in my head. There's nothing wrong with documenting. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be a photographer, but I wanted to create images. Melting giants. A few years ago, I did a long road trip to Nova Scotia. And while there, I just happened to overhear two gentlemen talking about the icebergs in Newfoundland. And so the next year off I went, a 9,000-mile road trip in my car. When I got there, they were having a record year for icebergs. They begin their lives in Greenland, where they break off and spend 9 to 12 months circling counterclockwise until they come along the coast, where they beach themselves, rock in the surf, and basically melt and die. And I thought this a terribly sad story, a short life. And so I created these images very dark with very high contrast. And this is their final moments melting on shore. These are the conditions that I photographed, though. They were very bright blue skies. And to give you a sense of scale, this one iceberg way off on the horizon on the right was probably 5 times the size of an aircraft carrier. But then as they break up into these smaller pieces, they just beach themselves and then rock in the surf, breaking up into these small ice cubes, 30,000-year-old ice cubes. Ansel Adams. When I was a boy, I think most who were into photography almost worshiped Ansel Adams. Not only did I love his work, I tried to imitate his look, and I even tried to imitate his images. I would go to Yosemite and try to find where Ansel stood for his iconic shots, and I tried to recreate them. There was no greater compliment that someone could give me than if they were to look at one of my images and say, that reminds me of Ansel Adams' work, and I would beam with pride. Well, one year I went to Review Santa Fe. This is where you go and spend the entire day showing your work to experts in the field, publishers, gallery owners, any experts. And I got through the day, got to the very last reviewer, and it was a long day. He was tired, I was tired. Showed him my work. He looked at it just very briefly and then brusquely pushed it back and said, "It looks like you're trying to copy Ansel Adams." And I said proudly, "I am. I love Ansel Adams." And he then said something that would change my photography and actually my life forever. He said, "Ansel already did Ansel. What can you do that exhibits your unique vision?" Pow. What an epiphany. It suddenly occurred to me. Was it my life's ambition to become known as the world's best Ansel Adams imitator? Can you imagine if Doss introduced me that way tonight? I'd like to introduce Cole Thompson. He is the foremost Ansel Adams imitator. Or did I have something to say of my own? Did I have a vision? And that set me forth on a 2-year journey to find my vision. Monoliths. Every year I go to the central coast of Oregon to a small town called Bandon, Oregon, where they have this incredible 2-mile stretch of beach that has these monoliths or sea stacks that stick straight up out of the sand. And every year for 15 years now I go. Different weather, different light, but more importantly, a different vision each year. And I always come home with something a little new and a little different. So vision, what is it? I had no idea. I'd heard people use the word. I had used the word in sentences, but I didn't really understand what it meant. Is it a style that you develop? Is it a look or a technique? Is it a creative talent that you're born with? Is it something that some people have and others don't? It turns out that it's none of those things. Vision is simply the sum total of our life experiences that allows us to see the world in a unique way. Let me illustrate. Imagine if you could take everything that you believe in, everything that you've experienced, everything that you've been taught, and put it into a blender and take that resulting mix and cast lenses that you then see the world through. What you see through those life lenses is your vision. It's just how you see the world based on your life experiences. Vision is not learned or developed. You can't go take a course on vision, come out with a certificate in your vision, but rather vision is discovered and followed. And why do I say discovered? Because the most important thing I learned about vision is that we all have one. In fact, you can't not have a vision. Why is vision so important? Because it's the difference between an average image and a great image. It's what puts your mark on it. It's what gives it life and spirit. Trees from a train. Years ago, I lived in Alaska, but I've never returned, and that always bothered me. Well, not long ago, a friend invited me to visit Alaska again because he had one of those 2-for-1 ticket deals, and I jumped at the chance. I didn't know what I was going to do in Alaska, but there was one thing I did want to do, and it was take the train from Fairbanks to Anchorage. It's a 12-hour train ride through the most desolate wilderness. And we were so lucky that we had a blizzard that day. Now, the first thing you do when you ride on a train is you get a window seat, you get your camera out, and you start looking for something to photograph. And you very quickly realize this is going to be difficult. Things are speeding by. And if you do see something off in the distance, it's soon gone or a tree brushes in front of you. So after that, I decided to go between 2 of the cars, and I opened both doors so I could photograph out each side. And I started photographing the trees. Then I started panning the trees. Then I thought to myself, what would happen if I used a long exposure and panned the trees? And I started getting these incredible swirls that I just didn't understand at the time. And it's the tree that I would try to keep in the center of the frame remained pretty still, but everything else around it swirled. And I loved the effect. So for the next 12 hours, I just photographed these trees from a train and had a fun time with it. Later, I found out it was because I was using a focal plane shutter that was traveling one way as the trees were traveling another and the train another. And it was this combination of three movements that caused this incredible swirling motion. And this image was on the cover of Lenswork 2 issues ago. So how did I find my vision? As I mentioned, I didn't even know what vision was. So how was I going to find it? So I came up with 10 ideas, 10 steps that I thought might help me find out if I had a vision. I really didn't know what I was doing, but I just trusted if I would stick with these 10 steps, I would learn something. The first thing I did is I printed all my images and I put them into 2 stacks. Images that I really, really loved and everything else. Now, what do I mean by everything else? These are images that others loved, images that won contests, images that got a lot of likes on social media. But if I couldn't say that I love that image, it couldn't go in that 1 stack. Then I committed to never again producing work that I didn't really love. If I came across a scene that I knew would be a big hit, or it would sell, or win a contest, or get a lot of likes, I said no. If I don't love it, I won't do it. Then I practiced photographic celibacy, which is kind of a controversial practice. I don't look at the work of other photographers. And why? Well, I reasoned that if I was going to find my vision, I needed to stop immersing myself in the vision of others. I wanted to see things freshly. In a sense, I imagined what would it be like if Stevie Wonder suddenly had his eyesight restored through some new surgical procedure, and he saw things for the very first time. I thought to myself, that's how I would like to see. Now, I can't erase everything I've seen in the past, but I could stop immersing myself daily in other people's vision. Then I had to change my mindset from photographer to artist. I think part of me gravitated towards photography because I thought it was a scientific art and that I could compensate for my lack of creative ability by excelling in the technical side. Now I had to believe that I really could be creative. And that one of the hardest things, I had to stop caring what other people thought of my work and just create work that I loved with no thought of how it would be received by other people. It took me 2 long, hard, gut-wrenching years, and at times I was so discouraged I wanted to give up, but I persisted and I finally did understand and find my vision. Now, just to give you a sense of what vision looks like, I'd like to show you some before and after images, because really the before image shows you what I see with my eyes. The after image is showing you what I was imagining in my head. This is the angel Gabriel. The first time that I exercised my vision, as I stood there, I actually knew what the image would look like when it was complete. And that became a roadmap for me to follow as I took the shot and as I processed it. This is skeleton. This is a pile of bones that I found along the Poudre River in my hometown, exactly as they lay. But as I saw it with my eyes, I could see the technical challenge. I had bright leaves and bright bones. And in my mind, I saw dark leaves and white bones. And I didn't necessarily know how to do it, but I found a way to create the image the way it was in my vision. This is called the Jim Bridger Power Plant, a recent image from Wyoming. And as I stood there on that very cold blue sky day, I imagined that image looking as almost nighttime. The great thing about vision is that it drives the taking of the picture and it drives the processing of the image. And Windmill and Moonlight show from Grand Island, Nebraska. It was a very cold, dark night, but I had almost a full moon. And so I had a real tough exposure problem. How did I expose for both the sky and the foreground? Well, I simply took 2 shots, one for the sky, one for the foreground, and then combined them later in Photoshop. Now, some people say, after seeing your before and after images, I realized that I need to learn a lot more about Photoshop. And that is exactly not my point. Some people think that you need to have great technical skills before you can express your vision. I run into so many people who say, I need to learn the tools in my toolbox before I can express myself. And I so disagree with that. I say first, find your vision and then learn the skills that are needed to execute that vision. When I created my series, The Ghost of Auschwitz-Birkenau, I had no idea how I was going to create these ghosts, but I had that idea in my head. I could see it. And so I found a way to do it. I never let the technical stop me from proceeding with the project. The technical actually is the easiest part of the formula. This is another example of not knowing what to do. This was, to me, the best image out of my Melting Giant series. I just love the shape of this iceberg, but there was a problem. It was rocking so badly in the surf that I couldn't do a long exposure. So I simply took a short exposure and reasoned that I would find a way to make it into a long exposure. And I did. I found a way to, after the fact, turn it into a long exposure. This is a recent image from Idaho, from my Powerline series. And this is the color image, and then the black and white image. A lot of people might see that with their vision in color, but I see things in black and white. And this is one from the series from Bandon, Oregon. There's the before and the after. The vignetting you see in the before shot is simply because back when I took this image, we had to stack ND filters. We didn't have a good source of ND filters. So there's 2 filters there and a polarizer causing a lot of vignetting. My post-processing is very simple. I typically only use 6 tools in Photoshop. Now, I'm not suggesting that you need to use these 6 tools, but I want to show to people that you don't need a complicated procedure to do good work. First thing I do is I simply bring the image in and play with those sliders until the image gets as close to my vision as possible. I then convert it to black and white. And this is where you can take those color sliders and change dramatically what the image looks like. It's like applying a color filter after the fact. Let me give an example. Here's 4 shots. They're all the same shot, color image. The only thing I did was change the color sliders. And look at the difference in those 4 images. That's why I don't want the camera converting the image to black and white for me. I want to be able to play with these color filters because it's a part of the creative process. Then I adjust my levels. And this is very important for black and white. For a good black and white image, I need a true black and a true white. And a lot of people will send me their image and say, it looked great on the monitor, but when I print it, it looks terrible. And the first thing I do is I look at their histogram. And as you can see, this histogram tells me that my image doesn't have a true black and it doesn't have a true white. So I just drag these little sliders over and I create a true black and a true white. Very important for black and white work. Then I dodge and burn. Now, dodging and burning is how I worked for 35 years as a photographer, but now I can do it with a pen and tablet, and I can work more slowly and more precisely. And what I did in this image is I darkened the sky and created a vignette. I increased detail in the wave area, and I burned down all that frontal detail so it wasn't so distracting. And then I add contrast. And the reason I do this is that a print will never look good as a monitor portrays the image. So I add a bit of contrast here to give it some pop. And that's important because a lot of people will see this on their monitor and they'll see this when they print. And that's because you need to add a little contrast. And then lastly, I simply remove all the spots because I never clean my sensor. And there's the before and after. And that's what my vision said as I stood there taking the shot. That's what it was going to look like. Popular photography called me the Photoshop heretic because they say I use Photoshop all wrong. And I used to be so embarrassed because I thought my process was so simple and so basic that I didn't want other people to see it. Until I realized that the only thing that matters is the image and not how you use Photoshop. There is no right way or a wrong way. Now I'd like to share with you the secret to post-processing. It is knowing what you want to do, not knowing how to do it. Knowing what you want to do is having that vision that drives you, that gives you a roadmap, that tells you how the image should look. I never just take the shot and then play around with it in Photoshop, hoping to stumble upon a great image. I always know in advance what it's going to look like. And again, my vision is like a roadmap that tells me where to go and how to get there. Isolated. Isolated is a very simple project about isolation that I express through trees. This and several other of my projects are open. I'm still working on them. And it's nice because no matter where I go, I tend to find something that will fit into one of my portfolios that I'm working on. Now, when I was in Newfoundland, I heard about the Bay of Fundy. It has the highest tides in the world, over 55 feet, and it's quite famous for that. And I wanted to photograph it at high tide. But when I got there, the tide was out. And so I had to wait about 10 hours until after midnight for the tide to come up. And I was poised down at the bottom, and the water actually came above my tripod legs. And it was so dark that I had to use an 8-minute exposure using a pen light to illuminate those hills on the sides. But I got the shot. So when you go to a new location, how do you prepare? I don't. When I go to a new location, I do only two things. I buy an airline ticket and I rent a car. That's it. I do not book a hotel because I don't want to be tied into a location. I don't look at other photographers' work, and I never look at a travel guide to see the most important sites or the must-see sites. Those have been photographed by a billion people before me, and I don't want to photograph there. And that's how I approached Iceland. I went, I drove, and I looked. And did I miss some of the iconic sites? Thank goodness I did. But I hope that I created some of my own iconic sites. Ironically, I took this image, created this image, and found out later it was one of those iconic sites. But I hope that I saw it for myself. The one thing that I did want to see when I went to Iceland was that bay where all the icebergs come out. But when I got there, they were having the storm of a century, and I encountered winds of 137 miles per hour. I was driving, trying to find some kind of shelter when my car almost turned over, and then all of the windows blew out and the car was stripped of paint. I was traveling at about 5-10 miles per hour following the stripe in the center of the road when suddenly the stripe disappeared and I didn't know where I was at. Later, a friend sent me this picture from the newspaper. The top coat of the asphalt had literally blown away. Do you dance? I heard this story on the radio told by a physician. He was an emergency room physician working on the Navajo Indian reservation when one Saturday an old man walked in with long gray braided hair, and he just stood there and looked off into the distance. The physician grabbed his clipboard and went up to the old man and said, "Can I help you?" And the old man said nothing. The physician, just a little perturbed, said, "Look, I can't help you if you won't talk to me." And the old man turned and looked at him and said, "Do you dance?" Well, this caught the physician just a little off guard, and he pondered that for a second. He wondered if this wasn't a medicine man who believed in healing through song and dance. And so he replied, "No, I don't. Can you teach me?" And the old man said, "I can teach you to dance, but you must hear the music." And I thought about this story. I thought about it for two reasons. First, it reminded me of a time in my wife's and my marriage when she decided we needed to spice things up a bit. And she said that we were going to start taking dance lessons so we could go out dancing. Well, we began these dance lessons, and it was very clear that my wife and I learned completely differently. I memorized the dance steps and would stare off into the distance saying, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. My wife, she closed her eyes, she listened to the music, and she flowed with it. I remember the very first time we went out dancing. She whispered in my ear, "Are you going to count out loud all night?" I wasn't hearing the music. It also reminds me of us as photographers. We can learn the technology of photography. We can learn about f-stops and depth of field and all the things that we love to tinker with, but we must hear the music, or all we're doing is taking pictures, not creating images. Harbinger. A few years ago, my son, number 4, Jem, and I were out on a father and son outing. We were in the desert of Utah when I saw these mud hills off in the distance, and so we stopped. My son wanted to stay in the truck, but it was so hot, it was over 110, that I said he had to come with me. And if you've ever photographed non-photographer family members, you know what a challenge that can be. All the time I'm with him, he's complaining about how hot it is. He wants to go back to the truck. He wants to go watch a movie while I'm photographing. And I'm photographing these mud hills, and they were pretty interesting, but sort of like the angel Gabriel, they lacked something. They lacked a subject. My son continued to complain. Can we go now? How much longer? You said 10 minutes, 10 minutes ago. Finally, I was just fed up and I said, okay, we're going back. And we just headed back to the truck. Well, as we got back to the truck, I just glanced back over my shoulder to those mud hills, and I noticed there was a singular cloud moving very quickly across the top of the hills. And then in just a moment, it was going to be over the mud hills that I had been photographing. So I yelled, we're going back. And we ran back up the hill. I got my tripod out. I got the camera set up, and I got one image. And I immediately named it. The first thought that came into my mind, Harbinger, an omen of things to come. People love that image, and they would ask me, are you going to do a series on harbingers? And I'd just laugh and I'd say, what are the chances? I mean, finding single clouds over interesting subjects. But you know, over the years, as I've become aware and as I've looked, I now see harbingers not everywhere, but frequently. And I've created a portfolio of them, and it's probably my favorite portfolio. And this project also was featured in lens work. I lay in this field in Nebraska for 3 hours waiting for that one cloud to center itself over that windmill. And it was there that I learned there are two basic type of clouds. There's a cloud that moves across the sky, and there's a cloud that stays in one place and forms and dissipates, forms and dissipates. And I'm glad that cloud never centered itself. I think I like it much better this way. So how important is equipment when creating an image? Not nearly as important as we think. Not nearly as important as your vision. A story. A famous photographer was invited to dinner by a wealthy New York socialite. She greeted him warmly at the door and said, I love your work. You must have a wonderful camera. He said nothing. At the end of the meal, he thanked her and said, that was a delicious meal. You must have a wonderful stove. Now, hopefully we all smile at that, because none of us for a moment believe that a good stove makes a great meal. Yet we sometimes, as photographers, act as though our equipment is the key. If I only had this camera, if I had more megapixels, if I had this lens. If I had to choose between the world's greatest equipment, but I couldn't have my vision, or a Kodak Brownie with my vision, I'll take the Brownie, because I know the vision is the key, not the camera. When I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, I spent all afternoon photographing this row of trees at the Winter Palace. When I got home, I was disappointed that none of the images were to my liking. Then I remembered I had taken a single iPhone shot with an old 8 megapixel iPhone camera. And I took that image, heavily cropped it, worked it, and created this image. Equipment is not as important as we think. Ukrainians with eyes shut. My son, number 2, was serving in the Peace Corps in Ukraine. And so my wife and I went off to visit him. And as is my practice, I made no preparations. I just hoped and trusted I would see something there that would result in a portfolio. Well, we're about day 3 into the trip, and I haven't seen anything yet. And I'm getting a little nervous. Now I'm counting down my remaining days. The people were interesting, but I always have this problem photographing people in a foreign land. When you ask to photograph them, they put on the big camera face, the big smile. And because I had no common language and I certainly didn't have time to get to know them, I couldn't break down that camera face. So as I was pondering this problem, we were at a bus stop and I saw a man leaning against a wall. And I approached him and I touched my chest and I said, America. He nodded. I held up my camera. Photographer. He nodded. I then did the universal symbol of, can I take your picture? He nodded. And after I took it through sign language, I said, stop, close your eyes. And his face squinted and he said, what? And I said again, close your eyes. And I took his picture again. And I noticed it got rid of the camera face. And so for the next week, 10 days, I walked around the streets of Ukraine asking people if I could photograph them with their eyes closed. And it was interesting because I made a number of good friends there, 2 of which 10 years later, I'm still emailing back and forth today. When I was in Lviv, a little old man, 5 foot nothing, shuffled over to me and in very broken Italian English said, what are you doing? And we explained. And he said nothing and shuffled away. A few minutes later, he came shuffling back, this time with a camera, and he said, can I take your picture? And I said, sure. And he said, with your eyes closed. And he took this picture of me and then emailed it to me. And as I closed my eyes, I suddenly realized how trusting these people had been. When you close your eyes to a stranger, you're wondering, is this a joke? Is it a trick? Are my possessions safe? So I was very grateful to the Ukrainian people for their patience and understanding. Cole's rule of thirds. I was exhibiting one of my portfolio's ancient stones in Boulder, Colorado, when a woman walks up, stands next to me, and said, that image doesn't follow the rule of thirds. And this one, you should never put your horizon on the center line. And I just looked at her and I was amazed. I was astounded. She could not see the images. She could only see rules not followed. So, sort of in jest, I created my own rule of thirds, which states a great image consists of 1/3 vision, 1/3 the shot, and 1/3 processing. But it's the vision which is the key because it's what's driving the shot and driving the processing. For years, I only focused on the latter 2 steps, the shot and the processing. And I thought through my technical excellence, I could overcome my lack of creativity or vision. Really, all I created was technically perfect, but soulless snapshots. The lone man. I was photographing in Southern California at La Jolla Cove in San Diego at the children's pool. And it was a summer day, so there were a lot of tourists out on this stone jetty, and I was waiting for them to leave, and I was going to do a long exposure. Well, as soon as the people would leave, another group would come in, and I was getting kind of frustrated. So I decided I would go ahead and do a test exposure, get my exposure all right, so that when they finally did leave, I could get the shot. Well, I did a 30-second exposure with all the people on the jetty, and to my surprise, most of them disappeared because they were moving, except for this one fellow who stood still for the entire 30 seconds. And then I realized that I had seen this body posture, this attitude before. When people stand on the edge of the world looking off into the great distances, into the expanse of ocean or the infinity of the desert, they become very still and very pensive, very thoughtful. They think about things greater than self. Do I matter? What's the purpose of life? What am I here for? Is there more? And I call this moment when they're alone with their thoughts the lone man. This was my latest edition from last January in Death Valley. And this is one of my favorites because this is actually, that lone man is actually my daughter-in-law. I'm on a cliff equally as high as the one she's on. And it just scared me to death because she was there with my son and their child. and there are no guardrails in the Faroe Islands, and every year several tourists fall to their death. So a lot of my friends, photographer friends, love to discuss such esoteric subjects as what is art and what is fine art. I would like to offer my thoughts on the subject. Who cares? I only ask myself two questions. Do I like it, and would it look good on my wall? A few years ago, I had a high school senior approach me and she said, would you take my high school senior portrait? And I was going to say no, but then she said, I want it to be really different. I want it to be unique, something that no one else has ever done. And so that kind of caught my interest. And I created this image, which I named Ingrid Surrounded. Well, I just happened to show this to my friend who's got an MFA. And he said to me, I imagine he had a pipe in his mouth as he said it. Well, you know, Cole, this really isn't a fine art image. And I said, well, Russ, I never said that it was, but tell me why. I thought maybe there was a cow rule. And he said, because everyone knows that in a fine art image, the subject never smiles. And I thought to myself, how pompous. Create what you love, no matter what it's called or what other people think. Sometimes other people may not understand or like your work, and that's okay. It's not for them. At least it shouldn't be. Moi standing. When I was 17 years old, I read the book Aku Aku by Thor Heyerdahl. Thor Heyerdahl was this incredible explorer, and of all his adventures, I loved his trip to Easter Island the most. It was all about the giant stone statues there and the secret of Easter Island. How did they transport them across the island? Well, a few years ago, my wife and I were creating our own bucket list, and I just happened to think out loud. I said, I'd love to go to Easter Island, but of course that's impossible. And my wife asked very simply, why? And so next year, off we went. While there, I created 3 portfolios, and this is one of them. Of all the 1,000 moi on Easter Island, there's only about 30 of them still standing. And they stand on these altars called ahus, and they're very sacred to the Rapa Nui. You don't get close to them and you don't get on them. And these 7 ahus were the subject of this portfolio. The tallest moi on Easter Island is this fellow. He's 35 feet tall. And to give you a sense of scale, here's a horse at his feet. Giant creatures. And of course, the mystery of Easter Island was, how did they transport them? But I actually think the real mystery of Easter Island is, why did they seemingly in a day drop their tools and walk away from the moi, never to finish them? No one will ever know. Everywhere I go, I love dogs, so I make friends with the local animals, and part of me judges the people by their dogs. And for example, if you go to Russia, you don't pet the dogs. If you do, you're probably going to get bit and you will be getting rabies shots. But in Easter Island, the dogs are all wild, and they are the most gentle, docile, kind animals I've ever met. And they hang around the ahus waiting for tourists to come, begging for food. And we fell in love with this old guy. He was a mangy old thing, and we named him Graybeard. And every day, my wife and I would come by twice a day to feed Graybeard. So how do I pick a subject when I go to a location or want to create a new portfolio? I don't. It picks me. For years, I would keep a list of ideas that I would always keep in my breast pocket until I realized that I had never once created a project from one of those ideas. Every project came from a moment of inspiration and passion and excitement that just got me carried away. I'd like to tell you about one of those. It's called ceiling lamps. I was standing in a hotel lobby in Akron, Ohio, waiting to check out when I just happened to look up at the ceiling and I saw this ceiling lamp. And for whatever reason, on that day, at that moment, that lamp fascinated me. So I moved the table out of the lobby and I lay down on the floor and just stared at that lamp and then began photographing it. And then I started doing that everywhere that I went, photographing these lamps from straight below. And it was a fun project because they look so different than when you look at them from the side. And I can remember almost every single lamp where it's at. This is my favorite Mexican restaurant in my hometown. And I started putting them together in different patterns and series, and just having fun with the project. And then in Russia, when I was on the subway, I found these great Soviet art ceiling lamps to add to my collection. This also was in lens work. So why do I create? I thought about that, and I remembered why I created as a 14-year-old boy, simply to please myself, the pure joy of creating something that I loved and was proud of. But then I started noticing I could get positive feedback through my photography, and I started using it to get pats on the back. Then I argued that I needed to win because that was evidence that my images were good if they won a contest. Then I said I needed to build a resume. Who would take me serious as a photographer if I didn't have an extensive resume? Then I wanted to become famous, the next Ansel Adams. Then I argued I needed to make money from my art. And then some 50 years later, I've come full circle to once again create just to please myself. I'm sorry that it took me 50 years to learn that lesson, but really part of me is very happy that I did learn the lesson. I do my best work when I create for myself with no expectations. Linda Ronstadt said, I mean, it's nice to be acknowledged, nice for your work to be acknowledged, but it's not what you do it for. You do it for the work. And if you're doing it for the prizes, you're in big trouble. The Fountainhead. I was in San Diego in downtown stop and go traffic when I noticed the car in front of me reflected the skyscraper behind me, and it distorted the skyscraper. And I loved how it looked. And I told my wife about it, and I pondered, how could I create that same look? My wife suggested that I use a funhouse mirror, a flexible metal mirror, which I would take around, bending it and distorting the buildings that I photographed. And I went through the cities of the West and Midwest of the United States, just going to their downtowns and photographing these buildings all distorted. And because the mirror wants to place you in the mirror, I'd have to lay on the ground to get myself out of the image. And then I started doing it with long exposures as well. This is one of my favorite images from Portland. This image was the First National Bank building in Omaha, Nebraska. And there I was stopped from photographing by a security guard who would not let me go and insisted I give her my camera so she could erase my images. And I finally had to call 911 and have the police come and get her to release me. It was shortly after 9/11, and people were understandably spooked when people were photographing tall buildings. So what photographic rules should you follow? None, unless you want to create average images. You remember paint by number? I am assuming you guys had that just like we did down here in the States. I remember as a kid, we were promised that if we would follow the rules, and they were pretty simple, use the right color and the right number, stay within the lines, we would create a masterpiece. Well, maybe not a masterpiece, but a competent imitation of a masterpiece. You don't create a masterpiece by following the numbers or by following the rules. At best, all you can produce is an imitation. Ansel Adams said the so-called rules of composition are, in my opinion, invalid, irrelevant, immaterial. And an ex-Ansel Adams imitator said, there are no need for rules when you have found your vision. The Dunes of Nude. Every year I go to Death Valley in January, and I'm going again this year, and I spend most of my time on the dunes. The first 2 hours of sunrise and the last 2 hours of sunset, when the light is low and the shadows are long. And I just love the look. And it always reminded me of a portion of the human nude. So I called the series The Dunes of Nude. And I've been going there for almost 20 years now. Again, every year seeing things a little bit differently because my vision changes. Now, I'd like to share the key to a great image. It is not the camera, not how big your lens is, not your settings, not your location, not your software, not the rules that you follow, not how long you've been photographing, not your title. The key is your vision. That is what makes the difference between a snapshot and an image created. Vision first creates that image in my head. Then my skills execute that vision. And if I don't have the skills, I learn them. They're the least important part of the equation. Sugimoto said, if I have a vision, my work is almost done. The rest is just a technical problem. Lenny, a portrait of breast cancer. Lenny was a customer. She bought a copy of the Angel Gabriel from me. And about a year later, she called me on the phone and said, I've got breast cancer. I've had a mastectomy, and I'd like you to photograph me. I said, Lenny, I'm so sorry to hear this, but I really don't do that type of work. And she goes, well, I want you to do it. I said, Lenny, I don't have any skills in shooting portraits. I don't have any lighting equipment. I don't have the right stuff. She goes, it'll be okay. I want you to do it. I said, Lenny, let me give you the name of this woman I know who specializes in this type of photography. No, I want you to do it. And she just wouldn't let me off the hook. So off I went to Grand Junction, Colorado to photograph Lenny. She was insistent that these pictures would do other people good. And it was an uncomfortable shoot for me. I can't imagine how uncomfortable it might have been for Lenny. And all through the process of photographing Lenny, I had this one question that I wanted to ask her, but was fearful it would ruin the mood of the shoot. But as we neared the end, I gathered up my courage and I said, Lenny, what's your prognosis? To which she replied, I'll be dead by Christmas. That was over 15 years ago. And I'm proud to say that Lenny is still alive. She got into an experimental program in Texas and survived and had a new lease on life with a new attitude and a full head of hair. And Lenny is now calling and asking that I come and photograph her again. I don't know if you guys ever experienced this, but I have. People are always telling me what I should do with my images. I say don't follow other people's advice, not about your vision. When I created the Angel Gabriel, I was so proud of this image because, again, it was the first time that I had exercised my vision. It was the way I saw it in my head. But when I showed it to my mentor, she said, don't center the subject. How many times have I told you this, Cole? You're always centering the subject. And I felt conflicted because my heart said this is the way it should be. But here's this woman who is an expert and who is my mentor telling me that I should not center the subject. So I went home and I tried cropping it differently. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it. This is how I saw that image. It was my vision and my image. She might have done it differently, but it was my image. There are no experts when it comes to your vision. Another story. A photographer was exhibiting his work for the very first time, and in attendance was a famous reviewer, an art critic. The art critic approached the photographer and said, would you like to hear my opinion about your work? Sure, said the photographer, let's hear it. It's worthless, said the art critic. I know, said the photographer, but let's hear it anyway. You are the only expert when it comes to your vision. And important, don't ask other people what you should do with your images. People all the time say to me, Cole, what should I do with this image? And I tell them, look, if I told you what I would do with it and you followed my advice, soon your images would start looking like mine, and you don't want that. Confucius say, they who walk in another's footsteps never finds their own path. Moi, sitting for portrait. This is another of the series that I created in Easter Island. To get to Easter Island, I had to go from Denver to Toronto, down to Santiago, and then out to Easter Island. And that one long leg was, I don't recall, it was like a 12-hour leg. It was a long one. And as we flew, my wife and I slept. And as I slept, I dreamt. I dreamt that the Moi were actually alive and that I had set up a portrait studio. And I went around inviting the Moi to come sit for a portrait. But I encountered all kinds of problems. The Moi were very distrustful of outsiders because they had been treated so poorly in the past. Many complained about being too old, some too infirm, and a lot just didn't want to run into other family members whom they were having a dispute with. So after issuing the invitation, I was not certain any would arrive. Well, the day and time came, and only a few came, the younger ones. But as word got out, more and more of the Moi came and sat for a portrait. Well, I woke up from that dream, told my wife about it, thought about it for a little bit, and then said to her, you know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to invite the Moi to come sit for a portrait. This series is those Moi sitting for a portrait. Now, of course, they really didn't come sit for a portrait, but I photographed them in the wild and put them into a digital background and dodged and burned to make it appear they were in a studio lit situation. I don't have any experience with studio lighting, so it took a bit of work to learn how to create that look. I would photograph the Moi when a cloud would come overhead so that I could dodge up highlights. Then I outlined it and simply dropped it onto the background. Just let go. Letting go was one of the hardest things and one of the most important things I did to find my vision. I had to let go of what other people thought of my work. I had to let go of conforming and doing it the way that all the other people were doing it. I had to let go of following rules, of worrying if other people would like my work or not. I had to let go of trying to win contests or earning likes. I had to let go of photographing the right way as I was being taught. I had to let go of trying to please other people. I had to let go of other people's expectations. I had to let go of the fear of criticism. I had to let go of everything. And once I did that, I was free. I could create anything that I wanted in any way that I wanted. I could break any rule that I wanted because I didn't care what anyone else thought. Vision is what's left over when you remove all of your fears and insecurities, when you stop complying and conforming, when you ignore what others are doing and you pursue what you love, no matter the consequences. The Faroe Islands. I was watching Shetland, and as the show was taking place, I was always looking past the actors to the coastline. Shetland Islands just seemed to have these incredible coasts that I wanted to photograph. So I decided off I would go. Well, I didn't know where the Shetland Islands were, so I got onto Google Maps and I got distracted because I saw something that looked even more interesting, something more isolated, a group of 17 islands called the Faroe Islands between Norway and Iceland. So off I went. I spent a month there, just wandering about every day. Such a dark place, such an incredible changing weather. It was so rugged and so isolated. I just fell in love with it. Part of you felt like you were in the 1700s because there were sod-covered roofs with these old rock walls covered with moss. And then you drive through a tunnel connecting two islands, 4 lanes brightly lit, and you were like in the 21st century. It was such a dichotomy. Every day I would come out of one tunnel and I would see this sight. And I photographed this thing every day. It became my favorite image from the trip. How long do projects take? Well, they take as long as they take. But I used to think they took years. And I certainly have some projects that have taken years, but they also can take just a couple of hours. I'd like to share one project that I completed in less than 2 hours: The Ghost of Auschwitz-Birkenau. When my son was in Ukraine, we decided to go next door to Poland, and we stayed in Krakow. The family was discussing what we should do with our 2 days there, and I knew that the death camps were nearby, but I didn't want to go. I'm what I call a sensitive. I don't like sad stories, sad movies, sad places. I just have so much empathy that I end up feeling terrible about a place. But the family voted and off we went. I didn't intend to photograph there because I just thought it would be sacrilegious or maybe disrespectful. But as we got off the tour bus, I was leaving my gear on the bus, and the driver saw that and he says, "No, I won't be responsible. You need to take it with you." So I ended up taking the tour with my gear. Well, we began the tour by looking at a book. And on the left is a 5x7 portrait of one of the prisoners, a beautiful black and white portrait, fine work, beautiful work. And on the right, in beautiful longhand, is the person's name, their family, their occupation, their possessions, everything about them. And your head begins to swirl. Here is this beautiful documentation of a person that they're either going to work to death or gas. Then they take you into the room with the iconic piles. Here is a pile of human hair that they would use to stuff mattresses and pillows. Here is a pile of glasses, and then a pile of human bridge work yanked from the mouths of the dead. And I'm not claustrophobic, but at this point, I cannot breathe. And I signaled to my family to continue the tour that I was going outside. And once outside, I just walked slowly, looking at my feet and catching my breath. And the longer I looked at my feet, the more I pondered who else walked in these same footsteps as I, perhaps on their way to the gallows. Who else had taken this same path to the gas chamber? Then I began to wonder metaphorically if the spirits of those who had lived and died at Auschwitz-Birkenau still lingered. And then I just had this thought in my head that I needed to photograph those ghosts. And so, using long exposures, I began to photograph the other visitors at the camp, turning them into ghosts. I had only 45 minutes left of the tour at Auschwitz, and then we would be off to Birkenau for an hour. So I ran from location to location. And my biggest challenge was that people there were so polite that once they saw my camera set up, they would clear the area. And of course, I needed them, unbeknownst to them, I needed them in the shot. So I would turn my back, play the part of the loud American, and I would talk very loudly into my cell phone, waiting for the people to slowly come back into the shot. Then using a remote, I would get the image. So in an hour and 45 minutes, I was able to create these 15 images. This is the only shot that I included a living person. And of course, the gas chamber with the ghosts, the spirits escaping. One of the privileges I've had in creating this body of work is that I've been able to show it at many Holocaust museums. And I remember showing this work at the Dallas Holocaust Museum and seeing a very old woman being pushed about in a wheelchair. And she was leaning forward, studying the images so carefully. And so I went up and introduced myself and I said, "Hi, my name is Cole. These are my images." And she, Edith, said, with this shaking bony finger, pointed at the images and said, "These are my images." Edith had been interned at Auschwitz-Birkenau and had survived. And I just couldn't fathom what it must feel like to be seeing these images. I also was invited to speak at the Simon Wiesenthal Center and show this work on the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau. There I was able to address over 100 survivors. And you know, it's one thing to hear their stories, but it's another to shake their hand and to hear them first person. Amazing things that they were just so unbelievable. It was such an honor to meet these people. So, final tip: what's the easiest way to make money from fine art photography? Sell your equipment. There's not a lot of money in fine art photography, but that's not why I do it. I do it because I need to express myself. There are things inside of me that I need to get out. And I don't do well with words. And so images become my words. Now, just to recap this evening, three-legged dogs are awesome, and so is black and white. The real key is your vision. Forget the rules. Don't follow other people's advice, not about your vision. Learn to let go of everything. Keep things simple and listen to the music. Thank you. I'm going to turn off my screen now and turn my camera back on. So were there any comments or questions that I could entertain? Or
Well, first of all, that was spectacular. I'm stunned from watching it.
you've heard it
Uh,
before, Doss.
I have heard it before, but it killed me this time as well. So I was almost in tears. Um, if you have a question, unmute your microphone and I will see you. Steve Gilligan, you're unmuted. Do you have a question?
I was just gonna, there's a couple things on the chat from Nina.
Okay, go ahead.
Shall we go through that? I'll just read through it. She's Nina, you're very expressive in your words, so give me a moment here.
I write better than I speak.
On the notion of vision, while I wholeheartedly agree that we all have it, I think we become aware of it at different stages of our photographic lives. And more importantly, we each have different abilities to express that vision. For some of us, our blenders might just be a bit less powerful. I certainly don't know what the end result will be when I take the shot, but I do know that something caused me to stop and take it. Do you agree that it is a journey and we all arrive at the destination at different times in different ways?
Well, I certainly do agree. In fact, I'll say that we don't all arrive, unfortunately. I believe that we were all born with a vision. And it was so simple. As children, we just created what was in our hearts. But subtly through our years, we were subtly taught that there were certain things we were supposed to do and certain things we weren't supposed to do. And we started learning to comply and to conform to a point that we lose our vision completely. We bury it under things that I call vision blockers. And I believe that it's only by removing those vision blockers that we can once again get in touch with our vision. But it's there. Like I said, you can't not have a vision. And so I love speaking to camera clubs. You guys are a little different. You're way past the normal camera club. But in most of those clubs, people are just taught there are things you should do, things you shouldn't do. There are ways that you should photograph, ways that you shouldn't photograph. And we don't get in touch with what's in our heart and our own vision. And that's really my mission. The reason I speak to groups is to help people understand. Don't listen to other people about what you're supposed to do. Do what you want to do, what you love, what's in your heart. And will you immediately be successful? No, but it is a journey, like you say. And I'm just so grateful that after 50 years of photographing, I found something more than just being a technically proficient photographer and learn to create.
Awesome.
Matthew, do you have a question?
Actually, it's interesting. As it happens today, Ilford Photo, the makers of black and white film and paper, have a Wednesday Wisdom series on their social media. And today, Cole, they quoted you. They quote you saying, "Color attracts my eye, but black and white holds my attention." Now, I trust that you're faithfully quoted there. But so Ilford Photo certainly thinks that you have a black and white aesthetic that they admire. And I mean, to me, it looks very film-like. You've detailed your process and you emphasize simplicity and de-emphasize the importance of equipment. So why not film? Why not black and white film that can get you most of the way to what you're doing from the camera, not from the processing?
Well, I am open to any process that helps me do my work better. And having worked for 35 years in film, I think I understand what film can do. I think I can do better with digital. I remember one exhibition where somebody came up to me and said, "You just can't do work like that with digital." Of course, all my work is digital, but he couldn't tell the difference. And I don't think anyone can. I think that business about I can tell the difference between digital and film is it's an argument that died long ago. So I use digital because I can do better work with it. I can do things with it that I never could do with film. And I can take my time at it instead of having to, dodge and burn under an enlarger where I have only a few seconds to try to create what I'm seeing in my head. So to me, digital is just better. But that's, everybody thinks differently. Some people think film's better and they stick with film. So the only thing that matters is the image, not the process, not the camera, not anything else. I think we should only look at the image and judge it by what do we see there.
How about you, Cass? Do you have a question? Perhaps about photographic celibacy?
Well, I guess only do you still practice it. I can understand the rationale, and I disagree with it strongly. So I'm really torn.
I still do.
I find myself hugely inspired. The group you're speaking to this evening is one of the groups that inspired me when I kind of was first getting very serious about my photographic work. And I credit them with helping me find my vision. And so I have a really hard time with your position. I can understand not wanting to look at photographs of places that I'm going to go. And I get that, but just in general, I think I wouldn't be where I am today, my exalted position, if it hadn't been for the people on the screen here helping me find that way.
Well, I understand you're not alone. I tell people that 85% of the people think I'm just plain nuts. 14% say, I understand what you're doing, but I think you're still nuts. And only 1% I've ever met have ever tried it. I still do it 15 years now. I not only find it useful. Let me talk about something else I do. I have a definition. I call it creating honest work. For me, honest work is work that it is my idea. I just didn't see somebody else's idea and tried to do it differently or better. It is work that I came up with the idea myself. It is work that doesn't try to imitate or copy. It's strictly mine. It came completely out of my heart and out of my mind. And I think photographic celibacy is how I've been able to do that. My Ghost of Auschwitz series, I don't think anyone has ever done a series at Auschwitz-Birkenau like that. My Trees from a Train, I think they are completely unique. My Harbinger series, I think every one of my series are not only different than other people, they're different than from myself. I don't do bodies of work that all look the same. And I credit this to trying to not look at other people and getting their ideas, but looking at the world and getting ideas. So I have softened on my position a little bit that I believe that perhaps photographic celibacy is something people might try when they're in the right place for it. I used to be, you ought to go your whole life and never look at other people's work, but I realize I am heavily influenced by the looking in my past. It did contribute to who I am today. But at a point, I needed to be me and not be Ansel Adams or Edward Weston or Comet Cunningham or Strand or anyone else. And so I stopped looking, and I look forward to the day that I will again look at other people's work. But I suspect that won't be until maybe I'm too old and I can't do my own work anymore, and my enjoyment will come from looking at other people's work. So I understand what you're saying, Cass. So
No, thank you. It totally makes sense. You're just better than I am and more confident, perhaps.
No, it all comes down to vision. Here's what I had. One man, I was doing this presentation live in New Jersey, and in the middle of the presentation, he goes, "You do what?" And I explained it again, and he goes, why in God's name would you do that? I get such great pleasure at looking at other people's images. And I responded, I do too, but I want to find my own vision more than I want to look at other people's work. My entire being is focused on seeing anew, seeing fresh. And I think that I've touched 10% of my potential. And I just really am always working at seeing the world the way I see it, not the way others have seen it and they're recorded in my brain.
Let me make the comment that you don't get too old.
You don't get too what?
You don't get too old to still
Oh.
photo.
Good
No,
for you, Tom.
That's a great quote by Edward Weston. He said when he was confined to his chair with Parkinson's disease, he said, I should be able to look down at my feet and see something to photograph. So even with Parkinson's, I see that I've disappeared. Can you guys see me anymore?
No.
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 I don't know why I disappeared. I had this happen once before. I'm going to try starting it, but
There you
You're
are.
You're
back.
back. You're
It's a
back.
technical problem of no importance.
Okay, Michael Anderson, you have a question?
I have a comment and then a question. The comment is cold. There's a wonderful short story by Ray Bradbury about a composer who was kept in the wilderness and was not allowed to listen to other people's music, so that the music he learned to write was just his own. And one day the critic came by and discovered, by listening to the music this guy had written, that he discovered Bach, at which point he was no longer allowed to be a composer and he became another critic. It's a wonderful short story. My question is this, though. The Focal Forum, I was really happy to hear you say that we're not like other camera clubs, because that's an article of pride for us. But we are a group that tries to learn from each other. So we meet every other week, as Das was saying, and we put images up on a light box and we look at them and then we critique them and we make comments. And sometimes we're at risk of falling into being a mutual admiration society, which is not particularly helpful. But when we have great conversations, it's about things that people like or don't like in an image that they're looking at. And when we have those conversations, we all get to learn by critiquing and commenting on other people's images. And on the face of it, that flies in the face of your artistic sort of being a celibate. So with a group like us, how do you square that circle between hewing to your own line, pursuing your own path, pursuing your vision, and at the same time having the opportunity to learn from each other?
Well, I've written an article about this.
Would you
For
send it to
camera
us?
clubs, for camera clubs, suggesting that instead of competitions or critiques, they have a different format. That a person come in, sits in the center of the room with everyone around them, and tells them what their vision was, how they took the shot, how they processed it to try to get the image to conform to their vision, what they think they missed and what they thought they hit with it, and that people could not say anything about what they would do because it's not their image, it's not their vision. They could only say positive things that they enjoyed about the image. But it was really a session for the person to identify with their vision and what it was they were trying to do, focusing the club more on vision, their vision, rather than what other people would have done with it. I mean, we've all said this to someone else. If that were my image, here's what I would do. But it's not my image. It wasn't my vision. Just like my mentor who said, I shouldn't have centered the angel Gabriel. Maybe she shouldn't have centered it. She wouldn't have centered it. It wasn't her image. It wasn't her vision. So I suggest vision sharing as a way to help people focus on vision, not on technique or listening to other people's ideas. And I know that's not popular with any club, but that's how I see the world.
Well, I'd like to pitch that idea across to the executive and say, if you guys want to take that on, we should try it out.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Sounds like a good idea to me. We will
Michael's-
discuss.
Michael's just volunteered himself as moderator.
Ah, good. We needed that.
Thank you,
Catherine
Cass.
Keats.
Lovely to see you again.
Yeah. Catherine Keats, you have a question?
No, I was also thinking about the celibacy issue, and I'm wondering how much actually it's the celibacy, or is it this blender effect, which I love that analogy about all the things in your life that have come together, put in a blender and then rendered into lenses through which you see the world. And I'm wondering, if you were to weigh the celibacy versus that, how much is there that gives you your vision?
I think that clearly, if I had been raised with never seeing any of those great photographers' work, I wouldn't have that influence, and my work might look different. So it is a fact. I can't turn the clock back and do it differently. But like I said, maybe at some point when a person says, I really want to find, that was me. I want to find my vision. I want it so badly, I will do anything to find it. And given that sentiment, it wasn't a great sacrifice to stop looking at other people's work because I was so focused on my goal. So maybe at a certain point in one's evolution, it becomes appropriate to try. I've had several people do it with great success. Now, I've never had a single person continue it past more than a couple of years. Hey, did Ross, you have something you were trying to say?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could elaborate on the idea of projects, how you think about them, how you structure them, and really it's at some level it's a practicality issue, is how do you implement and keep track of them all, right? And how does that relate? How did that help you create or confirm your vision to yourself?
Well, it's so interesting because I'm going to give a presentation Friday night on how I did portfolios, how I create my projects. And I first am going to go through and talk about all the things that I tried that didn't work. The very first thing I did when I got that note from Lenswork was when he said I needed to supply 15 images on a single subject. I said, well, I've got a bunch of images. I'll bet I can find 15 that'll work together. Didn't work because they were just, afterthoughts. I did it with trees and that didn't work. Then I would try to look at other people's work. I'd look through the internet, look at other people's work, try to find an idea and try to do it a little differently. That goes under the quote, good artists borrow, great artists steal. To me, that's copying, and I didn't want to do that. Then I would do the route where I'd go to a location and I would look at what other people had done. I'd look at the travel guides. And I just had all these things that I tried that didn't work. And I finally got to this point where I just said, I need to see something fresh. I need to see it. No iconic sites. Those are off the table because they've been done by other people. And I just go and wander now. And I wait for something to catch my attention, to catch my excitement, my passion. And once I have found that, it just happens. It's just natural. I have so many people write me and say, hey, I'm just stuck. I've been working on this project and I'm just stuck. I can't get excited about it. And I tell them, you got the wrong project. The project that is the right one is the one that you're skipping work to come home early because you only got a couple hours of sun left because you can't wait to get in and work on it. Not one that you got to force yourself to do. So passion, I always tell people that my best projects come at the intersection of vision and passion. Two most important ingredients.
Right. So it sounds like it's best not to make a big deal about this, really just kind of follow the intuition rather than get elaborate.
That works for me. I have friends though that plan out a project before they ever take a single shot and they have it all mapped out in their head and they work better through planning. I work better through inspiration.
Thank you.
So Cole, you've been photographing for 50 years, whatever it is. and you've learned a lot. You have your vision. What is next for you?
I've got no goals like photographic goals. One of the things I learned in my 50 years is to define success for yourself. For too long, I operated under the assumption that success meant having work that was published, having work in big name galleries, and having work that sold for a lot of money. I thought that was success as a photographer until I started getting some success, and I enjoyed the 15 minutes of fame. But the problem was in the morning, it was still just me and my work and how I felt about it. So I decided that I needed to redefine what success meant for me. And it's very simple, creating images that I love. And so my only goal in life now is to create images that I am proud of, whether or not, and I've got some projects that nobody really, they've never gotten much press or publication or anything like that, but that's okay. I still love them. So that's my only goal, is to create work I love.
Thank you.
I have no financial objective because I don't need money. I love being published in Lenswork. That's the only accolade that I find any pride in. And anything else is just unimportant to me.
So Cole, if this focus now is on doing work that you love, do you still enjoy sharing that work with others?
Yeah, I tell people that there's a difference between creating for others versus creating for yourself and then having some, like I say, accolades.
Mhm.
Those things are fine, but they're not success themselves. They're just the cherry on top. The real success is creating the work that I love.
And do you enjoy getting feedback from other people about their reactions to your work, or is that less important now?
It's not important.
It's not important. Okay.
And in fact, to be honest with you, I've always been easily swayed by praise. And so when I get praise, I have to work so hard not to let it go to my head. And, it really is a challenge because my personality is such that for most of my life, I created images to get pats on the back. And now it's just, I need to stay focused on what I think of my images.
And if I could ask one last question, what would you say to that 14-year-old you that's just starting out? What would be your best piece of advice?
Well, what I've learned through my own 5 children is, doesn't matter what I say, they're not going to listen to me anyway. That 14-year-old wouldn't have listened. I was
Okay.
just a bullheaded kid.
Okay.
Do you have a question, Tom?
A quick comment.
Okay.
I'm almost certainly at a different stage in my photographic life than most of you here. And I've had a lot of fun this last week because I photographed knitting.
Knitting.
The knit one, purl two, not the garment, the knitting. And I've put together a reasonable group, of which you may see 1 or 2. And it gave me pleasure. And I think the knitters will enjoy it as well.
All right. There's a lot to be said for just doing something you love to do. And, it's really important. I'd like to mention too, this idea of vision. I've given this talk to people who are not photographers, to writers, to all kinds of creatives. And I find the concept of vision is equally relevant to any creative endeavor. And I mentioned, maybe you didn't notice, but I mentioned that when that one reviewer said, Ansel already did Ansel, what can you do that expresses your own unique vision? I said that comment changed my photography. And then I said it changed my life. It really was a turning point in my own personal life because I realized that just as in photography, I was trying to please others, trying to win accolades, trying to, get likes and wins. So in life, I was doing that as well. And I learned just to be myself and to pursue what I liked and think how I think and not have to defend it or go along with a crowd, just to be myself. So it really had a greater effect than just on my photography. Hi, Judy.
Hi, Cole.
Gilligan, do you
I'm
have a
going to
question?
give you a pat on the back. I really did enjoy your presentation tonight. But I want to say I'm heartened by your feelings about your process keeping it simple as you can as an artist, using it as an artist. I think a lot of photography, we have so many apps, we have so many things in Photoshop, Lightroom, blah, 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 blah. It goes on. And sometimes I think we end up with an engineering project instead of an art piece. And I know I'm not very technical, so it makes me feel a little bit better to think that maybe I don't have to go to all of these things. I don't have to bother learning them and making myself crazy, and I can still pursue my art, photographic art, just as simple as possible. So thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, there's not much simpler post-processing routine than mine. And I wish you could see a print because you don't, I would be so embarrassed. My friends are talking about layers and masks and all this stuff. I don't even know how to do a layer. I literally cannot do a layer in Photoshop. I don't know how. You don't need to.
I hate
Thank you.
What was that, Avi?
I say I hate him. I'm going through so much in trying to make the right image to myself, that is, and without the layers and masking and everything, I get nowhere. So how the hell you do that? Having said that, like, just a short question, actually inquiry. In your series of the single tree, there was a second or third image. Was that taken in Hawaii?
The very whitish one with the tree
Yes.
in the front. Yes, that was on the Big Island.
You stole my tree.
You know that spot, huh?
I know. We were there like 12 years ago, 12 or 13 years ago. And we were really struck by that section. And I think at our time, the tree was a bit smaller. And we took so many slides at the time, I think.
It was so much that when we went back to
We
Hawaii,
went back-
the next time we looked for that tree.
And we
Oh, my
found
goodness.
it.
Oh my goodness. Isn't that something?
I know, it is funny.
Oh,
But okay, so we were right.
We did a much better.
You did a much better job. Thank you.
Steve Gilligan, do you have a question?
Yeah, there's one on the chat here. The question is, Cole, do you go to art galleries?
Yeah, but not photo art galleries.
Okay. I'm assuming that's what the root of the question was. That's from Mord.
Yeah. Let's see.
Okay, well, it sounds
Anyone
like
else with a question?
come to a natural conclusion here. I would like to give away a copy of the Angel Gabriel. And in person, I have 2-part tickets so we can draw from a hat, but we can't do that here. So we do the birthday method. Who's got a birthday today? This week? Last week? Oh, Craig, when's yours?
8th of December.
Anybody closer than that? That's pretty close.
Mm-hmm.
You're the winner, Craig.
Well, thank you.
Would you send me, email me with your address and I'll mail it to you?
Yeah, sure.
Excellent,
Where
excellent.
do I find your email?
It's just
It's on your-
Cole.
It's on your website, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Greg, can we see your birth certificate, please? Just kidding.
I'm proud of Doss. He said he was going to lie and say his birthday was today.
I was.
Well, thank you very much. That'd be
We want to
amazing.
see the long form. I agree with that because I registered to have our city come in and clear away the snowplow, what the snowplow leaves at the end of our driveway. And I had to show my identification that I was a senior. So
Oh,
Craig,
my.
I think you ought to show your birth certificate there.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it. And I hope that you understand that everything I said tonight is what I do, what I believe. And I am not suggesting that this is how you should work. I think, as Nina said, there's, different ways to get to the same place. And to me, the only thing that matters is the image, and how you get there doesn't matter. The image is what's important. So thank you much for having me.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank
you very much,
you.
Cole.
Wonderful evening. Thank you. So nice to see everybody.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you
great
for
to see
having
you,
us.
Cass. Yes.
See you, Cass.
Great opportunity.
Carmen, Judy, good to see you.
Yep.
Okay.
Cool. Yep. We'll be in
Thanks
touch.
for the invites. Good to see old friends.
Matt.
Good
Yeah.
night,
And young
everybody.
ones.
Okay, good
Good
night.
night. Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank
Very
you
much.
all. Bye.
Bye.
My comment to
Happy
Richard Martin, I
holidays.
finally placed you.
What?
What was that?
Well, Richard